All right, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to treat Ireland's massive energy crisis like an economic case study. We'll diagnose the problem, look at the symptoms, figure out the causes, and see how a modern country tries to handle this kind of extreme pressure from the outside. Wow. Just let that sink in for a moment. Probably the worst ever. When you hear senior government officials, the people on the inside, using language like that, you know this is absolutely not business as usual. This isn't just media hype, this is their own internal assessment of the economic shock that's hitting the country. So, what does a shock like that actually feel like? Well, it looks like this number 11.1%. That's the estimated jump in energy prices in a single month. I mean, that's just a staggering, immediate blow to everyone's wallet, from family budgets to the cost of running a business. And that huge energy spike is the main reason Ireland's overall inflation rate is now sitting at 3.6%. And this is a really key economic point here. This inflation isn't because everything is getting a little more expensive. No, it's more like a concentrated shockwave, starting in the energy sector and rippling out through the rest of the economy. So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the energy shock itself. Then, the geopolitical event that kicked it all off. After that, we'll dig into the domestic issues that made things worse, look at the whole renewable energy puzzle, and finally, wrap up with policy, prices, and what might happen next. Okay, let's start the diagnosis. We're looking at the symptoms of what economists call a supply-side crisis. And really, all that means is that this problem isn't because people are buying too much stuff. It's because the supply of something absolutely critical, in this case energy, has been suddenly choked off. And this is where it gets really interesting when you put it in context. Ireland's inflation is at 3.6%, while the average for the rest of the Eurozone is just 1.9%. That's almost double. So right away, this tells us that whatever is happening, it's hitting Ireland way, way harder than its neighbors. And that begs the big question, right? Why? Why them? Well, to find that answer, we actually have to look completely outside of Ireland. The trigger was something called an external or exogenous shock. It's basically a fancy term for a huge event that comes out of nowhere and smacks the economy sideways. And in this case, that event was a major geopolitical conflict. And it all comes down to this one location, the Strait of Hormuz. You have to understand, for the global economy, this isn't just a strip of water. It's a critical artery. It's an absolute choke point. So much of the world's oil supply, the lifeblood of modern economies, has to pass through this tiny, narrow strait. And then it was shut. An escalating conflict involving the US, Israel, and Iran led to a sudden closure of that vital supply line. Just like that, the tap was turned off, sending instant shockwaves through the entire global energy market. And the reaction from the market? It was instantaneous, and it was brutal. Global oil prices skyrocketed to over $115 a barrel. So you see, you can draw a perfectly straight line. The geopolitical event closes the strait, that disrupts the supply, and boom, the price goes through the roof. Okay, so that explains the global price spike. But it still doesn't explain why Ireland got hit so much harder than everyone else. And the answer is that an external shock is kind of like a virus. Its impact really depends on the pre-existing conditions of the patient. So now we need to look at the vulnerabilities that were already there in Ireland's own system. It really boils down to a few key weaknesses. First off, a huge reliance on imported fossil fuels. That means when global prices jump, Ireland feels it immediately. There's no escaping it. Second, they have very little domestic energy storage, so there's no backup, no buffer to cushion the blow. And all of this is happening on an electrical grid that was already stretched to its limit because of fast-growing demand. And where is all that new demand coming from? Well, a massive piece of the puzzle is the data center boom. These giant, power-hungry facilities that run our digital world are using up a huge and growing chunk of Ireland's electricity. This kicks off a whole debate because they often get cheaper electricity rates than regular homes, even while their explosive growth is threatening the stability of the whole national grid. So a crisis like this makes everyone ask the obvious question, right? What's the long-term fix? And the conversation immediately turns to renewable energy. But as we're about to see, just flipping a switch to green energy isn't as simple as it sounds. It comes with its own very real, very complex challenges. So, let's look at the numbers. Right now, renewables account for about 16% of Ireland's total energy. And when you break that down, you can see one source is the clear giant here, and that's wind power. It makes up the biggest slice of the pie by far. followed by things like biodiesel and biomass. But even with wind being the star player, it's facing some major hurdles. You've got grid congestion, which basically means traffic jams for electricity. You have long delays in getting new projects approved. And then there's the biggest challenge of all, intermittency. The wind doesn't blow 24/7, which means you still need to have fossil fuel power plants ready to fire up at a moment's notice as backup. Okay, so what about solar? Well, check out this number, a 69% increase in solar power in just 1 year. That's a massive growth rate, and it shows there's a ton of momentum and potential building in that sector.
But, and it's a big but, that growth is starting from a really small number. And solar has its own set of problems. I mean, first, the obvious one, Ireland isn't exactly the sunniest place on Earth. But beyond that, you run into the same old issues. Projects take forever to get built, and there are bottlenecks just trying to get the power they do generate connected to the grid.
All of these challenges with renewables are forcing a very controversial question back onto the table. What about nuclear power? Ireland actually has a legal ban on it, but this crisis is making people wonder if nuclear could be the answer for providing stable, low-carbon, base-load power. That's the always-on electricity you need around the clock, which, as we've seen, wind and solar just can't guarantee by themselves. So with all this going on, how is the government actually trying to deal with it? Let's look at the immediate, short-term fixes they're trying, and then think about what the long-term outlook might be. The government's first move was to try and give people some immediate relief. Essentially, they put in a temporary tax cut at the gas pump. As you can see, they knocked 17 cents off a liter of petrol, 22 cents off diesel, and a bit less for green diesel. Now, this is a pretty standard government response, but it's worth noting economists often debate how effective these cuts are. Are they the best way to help, or do they just add more fuel to the inflation fire? And of course, not everyone is happy with this solution. There are a couple of major criticisms. First, some people point out that other government policies like carbon taxes had already pushed prices up, making everyone more vulnerable to a shock like this. And second, you have groups like farmers and truckers who are saying, hey, this little cut is nice, but it's nowhere near enough to actually save our businesses. And all of this brings us to the main takeaway from our diagnosis. There is simply no quick fix here. Slashing taxes at the pump might feel good for a little while, but it doesn't solve any of the deep underlying problems: the reliance on imports, the strained electrical grid, and the vulnerability to world events. This requires real, long-term strategic thinking. And that really leaves us with a fundamental question, not just for Ireland, but for any country. This crisis has brutally exposed the trade-offs we all face between cheap energy, green energy, and reliable energy. In a world that seems to be getting more and more volatile, you have to ask, what price is a nation really willing to pay for something as fundamental as energy security? That's the multi-billion-dollar question.